Hey, my friends. Hope you guys are good. I just want to talk about the stages of grief. Not a fun topic, but you know, someone has to talk about it. So I'm going to try to keep it as lighthearted as possible. But I know a lot of people avoid the topic, just like they don't want to talk about funeral homes or going to the hospital. They just don't want to talk about it because it's not pleasant. But what we see, though, and I'm sure, if you've gone through grief, and most of us have, I know I have, is that once you get on the other side, you're stronger and you see life differently. And at least in my situation, I've grown as a person. And so grief is really a tool, or can be used as a tool of growth. And we have to, acknowledge that grief is really the process of adjusting to change, in particular to loss. And what do we mean by loss? Well, obviously a person can pass away. Maybe a pet could pass away. So we could actually have death. That's a type of loss. There's also loss in the sense of you lost your job. You lost some purpose. You lost a type of activity that you normally did every day. Maybe you lost your house because you lost your job. Maybe you lost a relationship. The person didn't pass away, but the relationship is not there anymore. It broke down, or you had to end it because it wasn't healthy. These are all things that people grieve. You can also grieve when you lose something. Maybe you lost your wallet or your keys. There's a little transition there to kind of get over that. For some people, it's just a few hours of being upset, or maybe a day, but then you typically move on. It's also, in high contrast, though, when someone passes away, you're not going to get over that in a few hours or a day. You might, have to grieve for months at a time. So when we look at the 7 stages of grief, it just depends on how you grieve. Everybody's a bit different, and what you're grieving about. That's going to define your grief. And when we look at the stages of grief, it's not as if we grieve sequentially from like the first all the way to the last and in an order. It's not an orderly fashion for most people. It is for some, but for most people, they jump around in the different stages of grief. They may grieve in a certain way on one stage for a day or two, and then transition to another stage, and then go back to that other stage that they were at. So we have to acknowledge that it takes time for some people to work their way through the stages of grief. Now, the first stage is shock. Shock. It's when you're saying, I can't believe this. I can't believe this happened. And you're just in a stage of shock. It's just your whole being is just not comprehending it. And this kind of dovetails into the second stage, and these two really do work together. At least I've seen these two work together hand in hand a lot in grief, and that is denial. So it's not just like, I can't believe this, but it's the denial aspect of, I can't believe this happened. Like, it's shock and denial that you see sometimes all interwoven. There are people who go through a stage of shock first, and then they have denial, but I personally have been through grief that encompassed shock and denial at the same time. So that's very common, shock and denial. And that can actually take a few days for someone to digest really intense news, especially if it's like the death of a loved one. So shock and denial is really what we see as a psychological buffer. It's a mechanism that our minds and bodies have in place to buffer us from really intense news and lifestyle change, or just the change of reality. And if we didn't have this buffer or these buffers, we could be in a real world of hurt. We wouldn't sometimes maybe be able to function. We would probably shut down. At least some of us would shut down. So it's kind of like a safety mechanism here, if you will, shock and denial. And then this, for a lot of people, goes into anger, that once you start to realize that this is possibly true, then you're just like upset, and you're still possibly in shock and denial, but you could be mostly, though, just angry. And you will anger for a period of time. And this typically stems from various things. It could be the fear of the changes that are going to happen, or just the loss itself, just that fear of the unknown about how life is going to be in the future. It could be the anxiety of the whole event that's actually bringing about a lot of this anger, anxiety, and fear. Fear is another one, just once again, fear of the unknown. There could be guilt under all this grief, right? You may feel somewhat responsible for what happened. So you're going to have to work through that. And sometimes it manifests as anger. So be aware of that. Anger is really just the result typically of other underlying type of emotions and states. So you have anger. Now, sometimes you will go into bargaining, which is the next stage. But other times you will go into the stage of depression, because for some people, when they anger so much, they can become a danger to themselves and others. So as a safeguard, the body and mind has the depression stage built in to bring you out of the anger mode, the anger stage, and to kind of calm you down and bring you down. So it causes you to be a bit depressed, once again, to safeguard you from yourself and others. But there are people who don't go right into depression. They go into bargaining, and they think that they can solve the problem if they just talk to the right person or plead to God or whatever, because they're not at the point of accepting any of this. So you have the anger, which typically goes into either bargaining or depression. And then once you work through those, and once again, you may jump back to denial while you're going through some of this. You may just get, halfway through your bargaining stage and be like, I just can't believe this even happened. And you just refuse to, get to the point of even mild acceptance. So it's not uncommon for people to revert back to just shock and denial, and then go through some more anger, and then go more bargaining, and then depressed to safeguard themselves. And then you have testing, the testing stage. Sometimes it's referred in different ways, but basically it's a stage that people start to plan and look at options of how they're going to get back on track. Because the shock and denial is kind of worn off. They're not really angry anymore, and they're tired of bargaining. They're just through that stage, and they're coming out of their depression, or they're completely out of depression, and they're just wanting to get a solution. They're trying to be more objective. They're trying to be just thinking clearly as much as possible, and they'll test different little theories and different approaches of how can we go back to life as we knew it. And so we have that testing. And from there, typically at some point, you'll have a break. I mean, it'll just kind of hit you, and then you'll know it when it happens. And you'll know that you have now gone into the last stage, which is acceptance. That, okay, you really do see that it's real. You accept the whole situation. You know that life is completely different. Life as you know it has changed. And you have this big process of change that you've gone through mainly. And you feel different, and you see the world different. And, it can be a while before you come into complete acceptance. But when the bulk of you really accept it, you'll know it. And once again, it can take a number of months to be at peace with a lot of this. It can even be years to come to peace with some things that can happen to you. But it's a very good place to be, is acceptance. And so these are the 7 stages of grief. I hope this helped you. If you have any thoughts on this, let me know. The reason I did this video, a lot of requests for the video, believe it or not. And also there's a lot of this, a lot of talk about grief in the preparedness world, and it doesn't get a lot of attention. And it typically doesn't get a lot of views when someone does a video on it, or when there's blogs written. It's not very popular for obvious reasons, because no one really wants to think about this. I understand. But it is it's important on a lot of levels, as we know. And so it's just good to kind of stop and think about why we grieve and how we grieve, and basically our pattern of grieving, because we're all a bit unique. And just it might be good just to kind of think back and reflect a bit for a moment of how you individually grieve. And so you won't be that surprised when you start going through that process when something happens in the future. And so that's just part of knowing yourself, self-awareness. And so thanks for checking my video out. You guys take care.